Hey there, my name is Declan Murphy and I am the creator slash maintainer slash janitor of Flight Club. So if any of you saw the Starship SN8 launch on Everyday Astronauts livestream, you may have noticed that the simulated telemetry he used was, how should I put it, pretty inaccurate.
Our data's off, isn't it?
Yeah, this is way wrong.
Sorry, Declan, we love you, but this is taking a little different flight profile than I think we thought.
Yeah, let's upgrade that to really inaccurate. So what just happened here? That simulated telemetry is obviously simulated, and it is simulated by me using Flight Club's physics engine and rocket launch simulation tools to try and make a probable and physically possible launch profile that matches all of the public data that we may have about a rocket launch. Now, usually this is fine because we usually have a lot of public data. So there are a lot of hints we can use to predict the trajectory of the next upcoming launch with great accuracy. For example, Starlink Launch 16 will be coming up next month. There are 2 or 3 different ways that SpaceX launches Starlink satellites, but for each method we have a bunch of webcast data from previous launches showing altitude and velocity over time, and using that data along with locations of hazard zones, knowledge about the vehicle and the engines, the payload mass, the target insertion orbit, we can make a simulated trajectory which matches that data and also, obeys the laws of the universe, which is also important. When that happens, it looks a little something like this.
Oh,
And
my
right
gosh.
down the middle, Falcon 9 has landed. This
Declan
particular boost
Murphy.
has landed for the 6th time. This marks our 62nd successful recovery of a Falcon 9 first stage, and the 32nd time we've landed on this particular drone ship. Of course, I still love you.
Did you see how perfect the telemetry was, the simulated telemetry?
Great way to start off a Sunday.
What?
That looks much better. So what went so wrong with Starship? Well, for one, we knew absolutely nothing about this vehicle for certain. We didn't know its dry mass, how much propellant they put in it, we didn't know how high they wanted to throttle the Raptor engines, we didn't know its lift and drag coefficients, we didn't know how they change with different Mach numbers and different angles of attack. Since it's a high altitude test, we didn't know if they wanted to keep the flight subsonic at the expense of more propellant. We didn't know if they were going to fly out over the ocean and come back, or if they would fly straight up and straight down. We didn't know how many engines they would use at different portions of flight. I could go on, but I think you get the point. And that was just the first thing that made this so hard. The second thing was that we also had no historical data which we could use to try and at least even estimate these things. We had absolutely nothing to go on whatsoever. So I had to do it the good old-fashioned way, guessing. So what are some assumptions we can make about SN8's flight before we even see the flight? Well, since Elon Musk himself gave this flight a 1 in 3 chance of success, we could probably safely assume that SpaceX are going to want to put as little propellant in this thing as possible, only just enough propellant that they would need to launch and to land, so that if it does go boom, the explosion would be as small as possible and the resulting debris field would be as small as possible. Another good assumption might be that SpaceX would like to keep Starship subsonic for the entire duration of the flight, since when a rocket starts going transonic, the aerodynamics start getting icky. Transonic in this case means between 80% to 120% of the local speed of sound. So the assumption would be to try and keep the velocity below 80% of the speed of sound for the entire duration of the flight. One quick note, the reason that the transonic regime starts at around 80% of the speed of sound and not at 100% of the speed of sound like you might imagine is because even though the vehicle itself is still subsonic and the average speed of the air around the vehicle is subsonic, there may be some isolated areas around the vehicle where the airflow starts to go supersonic, and in those areas it starts getting real icky. Okay, so there's 2 good assumptions to begin with. 1, keep it subsonic, and 2, keep the propellant load as low as possible. So with those 2 assumptions, let's take a look at the simulation that I came up with before the launch ever happened. This looks like a lot of data at first glance, but once you take a moment to figure it out, it's not so bad. So check this out. Here's the velocity graph over time, for example. The speed of sound is about 340 meters per second, although at altitude it does drop to about 300 meters per second. You can see that we're mostly below that for the duration of the flight. To do that, I needed to really throttle down the Raptors as much as possible after liftoff to keep the acceleration as low as possible. But even with the Raptors throttled down to a minimum, the acceleration is really quite high because the vehicle is so light because we have hardly any propellant in it because of our other assumption. So we lifted off with the thrust to weight ratio of 2.1 and never dropped below a 1.5. So this thing was going to leap off the pad. Now check out the altitude plot. Apogee was reached at about t plus 80 seconds, and then landing occurred at about t plus 4 minutes. In real life, Starship only reached apogee at t plus 4 minutes. The ascent was so freaking slow. Literally, as soon as it launched and I saw how slowly it was leaving the pad, straight away the first thing I thought was, crap, everything I have in Flight Club is completely wrong. Tim figured that out pretty fast too, and he pulled down the Flight Club powered data visualization from his stream so as not to be confusing his viewers who might not realize that it's just an estimation of telemetry, not real telemetry. So now that we have the beauty of hindsight, what have we learned from just watching the launch? Well, we know that about halfway through the ascent, Starship cut off one of its engines, and then again near apogee, it cut off another one of its engines. I had imagined this was a probability before launch, and I even said so on Twitter, but I just didn't quite have the confidence to implement that in my simulation without knowing for sure that I was part of the plan. Damn it. Well, whatever. There's one new thing we learned. We also saw it crawl off the pad at a snail's pace. And since we had it on good authority that the engines were firing at a high throttle at liftoff, this means the tanks must have been mega full, or at least full enough that 3 Raptors would just barely be able to lift it. I did some pixel counting on some of SpaceX video frames of Starship just before launch when the tanks would have been filled to their desired levels, and I measured how high the ice went. Then I used these measurements on the Starship internals graphic made by Raphael Adami, or Fael097 on Twitter, and I tried to estimate how full each tank was and then estimate the mass of the propellant. And I had to assume that the header tanks were full since they don't leave any ice formations on the outside of the vehicle, but I think this is a pretty safe assumption since if the header tanks aren't full, your landing burn ignition will be less than reliable. So doing these measurements, I came to a rough estimate of about 300 tons of propellant in the vehicle, but with a huge margin for uncertainty. Think about it, this vehicle is 9 meters wide, so even if you get the level of ice wrong by a measly 10 centimeters, that's almost 6.5 cubic meters of volume. And then there's a lot of guessing around the bottom of the tanks, like what shape is that? And how are you supposed to estimate that volume? And how much of that volume is actually blocked up by the header tank, or pumps and tubes and all that other very technical stuff that I definitely understand what it is. So I used 300 tons as my propellant mass, but I left it very open to change. And after all my tweaking and messing around, I finally settled on 270 tons, but the uncertainty on this is like plus minus 50 tons. Like it's so hard to tell. For now, let's assume that 270 tons is correct. Let's just take that. Okay, so now that we have a good estimate for the mass of the vehicle, and since we have some amazing footage of its ascent, which we can use to determine its altitude over time, and therefore its velocity over time, and therefore its acceleration over time, we can make a great estimate for the throttle settings over time. Well, at least for the parts of the ascent where we have good video, namely the first minute or so. So I did some more pixel counting on this epic 5.6K video taken by Everyday Astronaut in Cosmic Perspective, and I measured the altitude of Starship at every second in pixels. Now, since we know Starship is 50 meters tall, we can deduce a meters per pixel value and then use that to determine the altitude in meters. Now differentiate that over time, you get the velocity. Differentiate that over time, you get the acceleration. Do the same for the video where it's dropping out of the sky, and we can even find out its terminal velocity, as well as its velocity during the landing burn, and even through the impact. Pretty neat. Finally, watching the official SpaceX stream, as well as streams by Everyday Astronaut, Cosmic Perspective, and other streamers, it's pretty clear that apogee actually happens during powered flight, which was a huge surprise to me. I imagined that powered flight would end while the vehicle still had some upwards momentum, and that apogee would occur sometime after that. Clearly, that's not the case. It seems to me, by watching the vapor cloud coming off of Starship, that apogee happens somewhere around t plus 240 to 250 seconds. Okay, by now we've got a lot of data, so we can now make a pretty reasonable guess as to the entire flight profile. So this is what I have currently come up with. Actually, you know what? Numbers and graphs are pretty boring. So I've made a little repost of the official SpaceX stream, but with a Flight Club data overlay, where the data that powers these overlays is this same exact simulation data. And it really adds some serious perspective to the whole event to see this data alongside the entire journey. Take a look.
T-minus 10, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff.
So I matched my simulation inputs to every data point that I've spoken about here, and then I tweaked all of the unknown inputs to make the simulation result match what we saw on the live streams. The velocity for the first 60 seconds or so matches Everyday Astronaut's 5.6K ascent video perfectly, and after that, it's estimated. Watch the velocity here. You can see it start to drop briefly after each engine cutoff. This velocity drop after each engine cutoff is because I told Flight Club to maintain a constant thrust-to-weight ratio at these points in time, and it took a moment for the remaining engines to throttle up after an engine cutoff to restore this thrust-to-weight ratio. This kind of flight profile really kept the aerodynamic pressure down on the whole vehicle. I estimate that it never got above 5 kilonewtons per meter squared, as opposed to reaching 20 plus kilonewtons per meter squared with my pre-launch estimation. During descent, Starship reached a peak velocity of 140 meters per second, which occurred during the flip when the drag was quite low on the whole vehicle. Once the vehicle got into its belly flop configuration, drag increased dramatically and the velocity started to drop. Terminal velocity just before the landing burn ignition was down to about 70 to 80 meters per second. For reference, Falcon 9 gets down to a terminal velocity of about 260 meters per second before its landing burn starts. If 270 tons was a good estimation for the initial propellant levels, then it's likely that there was about 65 tons left in the tanks at this time. During the landing burn, velocity got down to about 30 meters per second by the moment where the first engine failed, but then began to increase again, and it was about 36 meters per second at the moment of impact. Oh man, I cannot watch that video without giggling like a schoolgirl every single time. If you want to see that video again without me talking over it and bringing up graphs and other stuff, I've uploaded it just from launch to landing with only the original audio on my channel, and that video is linked below, so definitely check that one out if you hate hearing my voice and you just want to share the video around. But for now, that's it for me. I really hope you like this video. I'm obviously a programmer, I'm not a video editor or a YouTuber of any sort, but if you did think this was interesting, please let me know and I will consider doing more like it in the future. And of course, like and subscribe down below so that one day I will qualify for that sweet YouTube monetization. In the meantime, please consider supporting me on Patreon, since that is my sole income right now, and literally every dollar you give me matters so much, and I will love you forever because you'll be enabling me to do this stuff for the price of like an occasional cup of coffee. Thank you. Thanks for watching. I'm Declan Murphy, and don't forget the first rule of Flight Club: tell everyone about Flight Club. Slán.